Well, hello, friends and family at First Baptist Roswell and anywhere else where you might be listening. Thanks once again for joining us for our online Bible study. We are delighted that we're able to do this. I've really enjoyed the study that we're currently in. Currently, we are sprinting through the Old Testament, and today we start session 6 out of 10, which means last week we finished the first half of our study. Sessions 1 through 5. And so we'll review those in just a minute. But I'm excited to get started on this second half of the study. You know, when we started this, it was a 10-week study. We started at the beginning of the summer, and I thought, I bet this will be our last one, our last online Bible study series, because in 10 weeks, surely this pandemic will be over. And it's looking like that will not be the case. So I'm going to start thinking about what our next series is, but we still have 5 more weeks of sprinting through the Old Testament. Let's get right into it. Let's review where we've been so far and then see where we are today. So we started at the very beginning, Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. God created everything, and throughout that chapter we see that God creates things and it was very good. However, in creating humanity, he also gave us the ability to choose. And in Genesis 3, we see sin entered the world. And so that was week 1. It took one sin entering the world. And then from that point forward in the Bible, from Genesis 3 on, God is putting a plan into motion to make things right again. So in Genesis chapter 12, which was our week 2 session, we saw God called Abraham to take everything that he had, his family and his possessions and everything, to pack up and move to a new place, and that he would be made into a great nation. That was our 2 fingers, and everyone on earth would be blessed through him and his descendants. And Abraham says, what descendants? Because he and Sarah, his wife, were childless at the time. They were old in age, but soon Sarah has a child. Abraham and Sarah name that child Isaac. Isaac has Jacob and Esau. Jacob's name is changed to Israel. Jacob/Israel has 12 sons who eventually become the 12 tribes of Israel. The youngest is Joseph. He's sold into slavery, ends up in Egypt with a high position of power under Pharaoh. Famine in the land where he used to be, where his family was. They come to Egypt. They reconcile, and now the 12 tribes of Israel are officially in Egypt. Over time, they live and they multiply in Egypt to the point where they're no longer known, they're seen as foreigners, and they're enslaved in order to keep them in line. So for hundreds of years, the Egyptians enslaved the Israelites until God calls up Moses to rescue them. After the 10 plagues, they are released. They leave Egypt. Pharaoh changes his mind, sends the army. They come up on the Red Sea, and they cross through on dry ground. But the Egyptian army is caught up in the sea, and now the Israelites are free. So that was week 3, the Israelites crossing between 2 walls of water. So, and if these fingers are helpful, keep them in mind. If they're not, just, ignore me when I get to that part. Now, they are now ready to inherit the land that God had promised to Abraham so long ago, but there are people living there. And so they send in spies into the land to check everything out. They come back and the spies are terrified of what they've seen. They say, there's no way that we can do this. The people follow suit, don't believe God can do it. And God says, fine, if that's what you want, I won't give it to you then. I'll give it to your children. And so God says that people have to stay out in the wilderness for 40 years. That was our 4th finger and 4 weeks into it. God remains with them. They carry around the Ark of the Covenant. They're a nomadic people in the desert. God still cares for them by providing them quail and manna and his presence, most importantly, his presence. So the next generation of Israel, led by Joshua and Caleb, enter into the land and win battle after battle. It starts with Jericho, where we meet Rahab, who assists them in overtaking that city, gives them information, and eventually becomes one of the Israelites, marrying into them and eventually becoming the mother of Boaz, who marries Ruth, who also gets her own book of the Bible later. So that happens. Jericho is just the first battle, though. Over and over and over again, Joshua, as a leader of the Israelite army, and the Israelite army in general is undefeated. They never lose. And until finally they are in the promised land 600 years after God had promised it to Abraham and his descendants. So Joshua gathers the people at Shechem, same place where Abraham was, and reminds them that all of this is from God. He has them stop. That was week 5, 5 fingers. Stop and reflect on all that God has done. Reminds them that they should never forget that all of this is from God, and that they need to make a choice now about whom they will serve. And so they commit right then and there numerous times that they would forsake all others and worship God alone. They say it 4 times. So thankfully, it's not going to be a problem for them anymore, right? No. Today, our lesson, that catches us up on the first 5 sessions. We are now in the promised land. They have their own land. But today our lesson is on the vicious cycle that we see Israel enter into. We are now in the book of Judges, and it chronicles the first years of Israel as an actual nation with land of their own. And right here at the beginning of the book of Judges, we get kind of a summary of what is to come. We kind of get this, here's what this book is going to be about. It kind of sets you up to know what's going to happen. So let's look at Judges chapter 2, verses 8 to 15, and we're going to see what is in store for us today in our next session of our sprint through the Old Testament. So Judges chapter 2, starting in verse 8, says this: Joshua, son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died at the age of 110, and they buried him in the land of his inheritance at Timnath-Heres, in the hill country of Ephraim, north of Mount Gash. After that whole generation had been gathered to their ancestors, remember that? That was last week. They all gathered. Another generation grew up who neither knew the Lord nor what he had done for Israel. Then the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord and served the Baals. They forsook the Lord, the God of their ancestors who had brought them out of Egypt. They followed and worshipped various gods of the peoples around them. They aroused the Lord's anger because they forsook him and served Baal and the Ashtoreths. In his anger against Israel, the Lord gave them into the hands of raiders who plundered them. He sold them into the hands of their enemies all around, whom they were no longer able to resist. When Israel went out to fight, the hand of the Lord was against them to defeat them, just as he had sworn to them. They were in great distress. So Joshua has died. This is a new generation of Israel. So their parents were the ones who had made this declaration, had committed over and over, yes, we will forsake all others. Yes, we will choose to serve God. And surely their parents had told this new generation of all the amazing things that God had done, and how in that moment they had gathered at Shechem and made a covenant before God. But no, somehow that message was not conveyed, or it was not received. The temptations were too strong, and the very next generation wanders off and worships the very gods that their parents had sworn not to. Keep in mind, the Israelites have their own land now. They have their own territory, and yet there are still plenty of neighboring communities around them, other kingdoms that surround them, and people who worship other gods. And we don't know exactly what was so tempting about those other gods. Perhaps it was just that you could touch them, you could see them, whereas God over and over, and especially in the Ten Commandments, says, don't try and make me into a statue. Don't try and create graven images of me, right? Don't try and make me into something that you can see and touch. And maybe that was what was so appealing to them. We don't know exactly what it was. Maybe they were intermingling and intermarrying with those other communities around them. But whatever it was, they turn away from the God who has brought them here to this point, and they worship those other gods. Now, we're dealing with centuries or decades at a time here in this study. I get that, but this passage is really only 2 chapters after last week's. Last week was at the end of Joshua. This is just the 2nd chapter of Judges. Last week, God won battles for them over and over, and they committed to serve him. Now, just a generation later, because of their unfaithfulness, they are raided by their neighbors, and the text seems to suggest that God is actively working against them because of their disobedience. It seems to be a common theme in all of our lessons, especially these past few weeks, though, the importance of good leadership. We saw the spies come back and were terrified, and they turned all of the people against serving God and following him. It cost them 40 years in the desert. Moses was a leader. Joshua was his successor and led them into the land, but now no successor is named after Joshua. We don't know why. And then how about the tragic implications of verse 10? A generation who knew nothing of God. What a failure of the previous generation. And so now they are in trouble. Once again, they're being raided. They can't seem to win any battles. They're in great distress, as it says. And so God, in his infinite faithfulness and mercy, raises up new leaders for them. And we now enter into the period of the judges, as they are called. Judges might also just be called leaders. These are not kings or queens. God remains king of the Israelite nation, but these are appointed leaders for them. So let's read on in the next few verses, which again continues the summary of the book of Judges. It's kind of this topic sentence for the rest of the book, starting in verse 16, going to verse 19. Listen as I read. Then the Lord raised up judges who saved them out of the hands of these raiders. Yet they would not listen to their judges, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshipped them. They quickly turned from the ways of their ancestors, who had been obedient to the Lord's commands. Whenever the Lord raised up a judge for them, he was with the judge and saved them out of the hands of their enemies as long as the judge lived. For the Lord relented because of their groaning under those who oppressed and afflicted them. But when the judge died, the people returned to ways even more corrupt than those of their ancestors, following other gods and serving and worshiping them. They refused to give up their evil practices and stubborn ways. So it would seem that it's not always entirely about leadership. God would honor the wishes and the desires and the presence of that leader, but even then, still sometimes the people would not listen. God would raise up judges to try and point them back in the right direction, but it says still they would not listen, but prostituted themselves to other gods and worshiped them. Well, that was kind of a generalization. There were times throughout the book of Judges when they do listen to their judges and they follow after them, and there's peace in the land. But when things got difficult, sometimes whenever a judge would die, and there's no natural successor, right? This is not a king, so it's not, or a queen, so it's not like their son would just take over or the next descendant. And then things would get difficult. They'd be handed over to their neighbors again because of their disobedience. They turned back to ask God for help. They would use God as a 911 call, and God, again, over and over in his mercy that never ends, would relent and bring peace to his people, right? It says, for the Lord relented because of their groaning under those who oppressed and afflicted them. So God has not left them. God still listens to them, but you can hear the frustration that if you would just stay with me through it all, we wouldn't have to go through this. And we've seen this, as parents. If you're a parent, sometimes you may have seen this before. You just wish your kids would listen and you wouldn't have to even hear them asking for your help. Did you hear the word used in verse 17? They prostituted themselves. This is a theme that runs throughout the Old Testament, but the Israelites straying to other gods, and it's the same true for us today. When we turn to other things and worship them, it's breaking a covenant. It's the exact same thing as marital infidelity, prostituting themselves, prostituting ourselves for something that is worth far less than what we actually could have, which is God himself. So we are now in this period in our sprint through the Old Testament. We are now in the period of the judges. Who are the judges? How many can you name? Before I studied this lesson and looked at this list, I could name 3. And once I looked at the list, I still could, only name 3. The other 8 didn't Didn't ring many bells. So here are the 11 judges. See if you know any of them. Othniel, Shamgar, Deborah, Gideon, Tola, Jair, Jephthah, Ibzan, Elon, Abdon, and Samson. So you probably know the Bible way better than I do, but I was familiar with 3 of those: Gideon, Deborah, and Samson. Samson, famous for Samson and Delilah knocking down the temple. He was like a super incredible fighter. Gideon, I know from a childhood church musical. We did a VBS musical on Gideon. I remember that one. That one was pretty good. And then Deborah, I don't know much of her story, but I know that she was seen as a good judge and led the people in good ways. So let's look. What we're going to do is we're going to take a look a little more specifically at a little of these. Chapter 5, Deborah is known as a good judge. We see her in chapter 5 singing praise to God for what he has done. And then it says at the end of chapter 5, while Deborah was a judge, there was peace in the land of Israel for 40 years. 40 years. So you have to remember, in all this vicious cycle, it happens over the course of decades and lifetimes. But Deborah, as a judge, led the people well and brought peace to the land for 40 years, right? So that's how chapter 5 ends. And then we enter into chapter 6, and it says this: the Israelites did evil in the eyes of the Lord, and for 7 years he gave them into the hands of the Midianites. Because the power of Midian was so oppressive, the Israelites prepared shelters for themselves in mountain clefts, caves, and strongholds. Whenever the Israelites planted their crops, the Midianites, Amalekites, and other eastern peoples invaded the country. They camped on the land and ruined the crops all the way to Gaza and did not spare a living thing for Israel, neither sheep nor cattle nor donkeys. They came up with their livestock in tents like swarms of locusts. It was impossible to count them or their camels. They invaded the land to ravage it. Midian so impoverished the Israelites that they cried out to the Lord for help. When the Israelites cried out to the Lord because of Midian, he sent them a prophet who said, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. I brought you up out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. I rescued you from the hand of the Egyptians, and I delivered you from the hand of all your oppressors. I drove them out before you and gave you their land. I said to you, I am the Lord your God. You do not worship the gods of the Amorites in whose land you live, but you have not listened to me." That prophet that was sent was Gideon, who is famous for being someone who felt like he couldn't do anything. He's called to be the next judge, and he's like, can't be me. I'm in the least respected clan, least respected tribe, least respected family, and I'm the least respected person in my family. And so over and over, he asks God for assurance that this is right. And there's a whole story in there of him laying out the fleece and it being wet and then dry. And over, God's patient with Gideon and reassures him, yes, you are the person who is going to lead my people. And so the Midianites are pretty scary for the Israelites. They're raiding. They can't stop them. So Gideon leads the people, not really in a winning battle, but in being so scary that the Midianites were too terrified to fight. Do you remember that story? They gathered at night and held up torches and yelled at the right time and smashed pots. And they so terrified the Midianites that they drove them out of the land. And then we get a little hint of what is happening and what is to come. This is some foreshadowing for the next few weeks. Remember, Israel does not have a king. God has said, I am your king, but I will raise up judges. Judges 8:23 says this: they tried to come and get Gideon to be a king, but Gideon told them, I will not rule over you, nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. This is an ongoing theme throughout the period of the judges. The people want to be like other nations who have a king. Here they've tried to make Gideon their king. You become king and then your son will rule. We can be like everyone else. But being the faithful servant that he is, he won't have it. And we see why he was a good judge here. He knew his place. He was not seeking more power. But still, we see it again and again as explained back in chapter 2. Look at chapter 8, verses 33 and 34, right? Gideon, fantastic leader of Israel, does everything right, refuses to be their king, acknowledges God as king. 8:33 says this, "No sooner had Gideon died than the Israelites again prostituted themselves to the Baals. They set up Baal-berith as their god and did not remember the Lord their God, who had rescued them from the hands of all their enemies on every side." This time during the Judges, we called the vicious cycle earlier, and that's our 6 fingers. We got to start getting creative, right? These fingers have to mesh with our lessons, but that's our 6 fingers. It's the stop and then go, right? 6 fingers, stop, go, over and over. They're hot and cold with God. A judge is raised up. Oh, yes, we'll follow God. Oh, God, we're with you. Oh, look at those other gods. That might be nice. Let's just go see what those other gods are about. Oh, goodness, life is hard again. God, can you please help us? Oh, thanks, God. Thank you for helping us and rescuing us. We'll never forsake you again. Oh, look at those other gods. That might be nice. Over and over and over again. And if we are not careful, you and I can fall into those same kinds of patterns as the Israelites. Hot and cold. Only turn to God when we want or we need something. We're supposed to be in an intimate relationship with God. He has called us his people, and yet it is no true relationship when you only go to a person when you want something. If you only ever spoke to your spouse when you just wanted something from them, or you just wanted them to do something, that's not a relationship. That's using another person. And when you only go to God, like we said earlier, as your 911 call, when things are really hard, well, that's not a real relationship. That's not the extent of the relationship. God says, I have so much more for us. You can know a deep, abiding love every day of your life. How much God wishes that we could every day follow after him, not just when things are difficult. And I don't know that every time we're going through hard things, I feel quite confident that not every time we're going through hard things, that is because God wants it. Sometimes we bring it upon ourselves. Sometimes there's sin in the world and God is with us through all that, making things right. But I do know that God can use the hard things in our lives to get our attention. And it's our job now to learn from the Israelites' hot-cold relationship with God. Doesn't that sound, when you hear it like this over and over, but no sooner than he died, they were back at it. It's so frustrating to hear. And yet, may we not be people who do the same thing. May we also avoid that vicious cycle. You remember last week, the stop and reflect. Again, that's a crucial part of this, to stop and reflect on all that God has done, to remember when we're going through the good times, to not get so fuzzy on who brought us those good times, on who gives us all good and perfect gifts, as it says in the book of Matthew. When we have prosperity or good health or the good times we're experiencing in relationships with one another, don't forget who gave that to you. Don't think that it was all because of you. Instead of this back and forth, I encourage each one of us to commit to a lifetime of discipleship, a lifetime of loving God, not using God, but knowing him more deeply every day. That's the call for you. That's the call for me. Let's think on those things this week, and we will continue with session 7 next week. Let's pray together. God, thank you so much that you, in your infinite mercy and faithfulness, never let us down, even though we let you down over and over. Help us to be people who learn from our mistakes and don't commit them again. Help us to be people who want to know the depth of your love and not just try and use you when it's convenient for us. Help us to be people who follow after your voice even when it's not easy. Help us to be people who seek after you, an intimate relationship with you as you have called us, as you have desired from the very beginning. And when we mess up, we thank you for your grace as you watch over us forever and always. We thank you for your love for us. Amen.